There is a particular kind of woman the frontier produces that no other landscape on earth quite manages. She is not made soft by parlors or perfumed by drawing rooms. She is made by wind and by distance and by the particular silence that settles over the high plains just before a storm rolls in from the north. She is made by years of doing what needed doing without anyone stopping to ask if she minded. She does not wait to be rescued. She does not arrange herself prettily in a window hoping someone will notice the light catching her hair. She is the one who notices the light, who names it, who files it quietly away alongside everything else she has learned to carry. Her name was Cecilia Drummond, and she was 38 years old in the autumn of 1887, and every man in Harlan County, Wyoming, knew her name. Most of them were afraid of her, though not a single one would have admitted it under any amount of pressure. She ran a sheep operation on 460 acres of high-altitude grassland that her father had broken and her mother had kept, and that she herself had expanded twice over by sheer unflinching negotiation. She could read a contract faster than any lawyer in 3 counties. She could read weather the same way. The ranch hands who worked for her said she had a gift. The way she stood outside in the early morning and looked at the sky and just knew. Knew when to move the flock. Knew when to hold them. Knew, perhaps more than anything else, when something was coming that could not be outrun and simply had to be faced. She had been married once, briefly, at 22, to a man named Porter Drummond, who had the remarkable quality of being both well-meaning and entirely useless in nearly every practical circumstance life presented. He had died of a fever in the winter of 1876, and Cecilia had grieved him honestly, and moved forward with something very close to relief, a feeling she had never confessed to another living soul and did not intend to. Since then, she had been proposed to 4 times. She had declined 4 times with a courtesy so precise it bordered on surgical. The county had long since settled into a comfortable understanding that Cecilia Drummond was not the marrying kind. She let them think so. It was easier that way. And then, in the October of that year, the fence came down. The fence in question ran along the northeastern boundary of her property, a stretch of split rail and wire that separated her land from the vast, rolling cattle operation that had been, until recently, owned by the Alderman family and managed by various hired men who kept themselves at a respectful distance. The fence coming down was not, by itself, a catastrophic event. Fences fell. Posts rotted. Wind had opinions. What made this particular fence notable was not that it fell, but what came through the gap it left behind. And that was 340 head of the finest Hereford cattle Cecilia Drummond had ever seen, moving in a slow, indifferent tide across the corner of her best winter pasture like they owned it, which, their owner appeared to believe, they practically did. She found them at first light when she rode out to check on the flock that grazed that section, and she sat on her horse for a full minute looking at them before she said a single word, and the word she said was not appropriate for print. She turned her horse east and rode to find whoever was responsible. She did not have to ride far. She found him at the fence line itself, already there, already working, already 2 posts deep into what was clearly going to be a full repair of the entire northeastern boundary. And this was the first thing that surprised her. The second thing that surprised her was the man himself. Augustus Kane was not what the county had described him as. He was not the bellowing, fist-throwing cattle baron whose reputation had preceded him into Harlan County some 4 months earlier when he had purchased the old alderman spread for what everyone agreed was an obscene amount of money. He was tall, yes. He was broad in the way that men who have spent their entire lives doing actual physical work are broad. His hair was dark, going silver at the temples, and he wore it without any particular vanity. He was, she would later calculate, somewhere in his middle 40s. He looked up when he heard her coming, and he did not look startled, and he did not look defensive. He looked, if she was being honest with herself, like a man who had been expecting her and had simply been waiting to see how long it would take. She did not dismount. It was important, she felt, to maintain the high ground in every sense available. She told him what had happened to her pasture. She told him with considerable precision and only minor profanity, which she considered a significant act of restraint given the circumstances. He listened without interrupting, which was the third thing that surprised her, because men who owned 340 Herefords and the land to run them on did not generally listen to anything without interrupting at least once. When she was finished, he took off his hat and held it at his side and said that she was entirely right, that his fence crew had fallen 2 days behind schedule, and that the gap should have been caught and it wasn't, and that was his failing. He said he would personally see to it that any damage to her pasture was assessed fairly and compensated fully, and that he was sorry for the inconvenience, and that he had already sent 2 of his men to begin moving the cattle back to his side of the line. He said all of this plainly, without performance, looking directly at her the entire time. She had not expected an apology. She had expected an argument. She had prepared an extremely good argument. She sat on her horse for a moment with her extremely good argument all dressed up and nowhere to go, and then she put her hat back on and said that she would hold him to that assessment, and he said he expected nothing less, and she rode back to her own land with the peculiar, slightly off-balance feeling of a woman who has picked up a stone to throw and discovered it is not a stone at all. The assessment took 3 days. Augustus Kane conducted it himself, which she had not anticipated. He arrived at her property line each morning at 7 o'clock, exactly, with a notebook and a surveying eye, and he walked the affected pasture section with a careful, unhurried thoroughness that she found, despite her best efforts, genuinely impressive. She walked it with him. This was a practical decision. She needed to make sure the numbers were honest. She told herself this was the only reason she walked beside him through the frost-stiffened grass for 3 mornings in a row, listening to him describe what he was seeing and what he estimated the recovery time to be. He knew land. That was immediately obvious. He knew it the way she knew it, from the ground up, from the soil composition and the drainage angles and the way certain grasses came back differently depending on what had been grazing them and for how long. He had not purchased that alderman spread as a rich man's amusement. He had bought it because he understood it and intended to use it properly. They disagreed about the recovery timeline on the second morning. She said the south corner would need 6 weeks. He said 4. She explained her reasoning with the kind of precise, methodical clarity she brought to every professional exchange. And he listened to all of it and then said, thoughtfully, that he believed she was right about the drainage, but perhaps underestimating the seed density in that particular patch. And they stood there in the cold morning air and argued about seed density for 25 minutes with the focused, unsentimental intensity of 2 people who genuinely cared about getting the answer correct. She revised her estimate to 5 weeks. He agreed. She noticed, walking back toward her fence line, that she had enjoyed that conversation more than she had enjoyed any conversation in recent memory, and she filed that observation away in the same careful interior cabinet where she kept all the things she was not yet ready to examine directly. The compensation he offered was fair, more than fair, if she was being precise about it, which she always was. She accepted it without effusiveness and with the kind of straightforward acknowledgement that told him she recognized the fairness without needing to make a ceremony of it. He seemed to understand this. He did not make a ceremony of it either. He simply said he was glad it was resolved and that he hoped the pasture recovered well. And then he said, almost as an afterthought, that if she ever wanted to discuss the water rights situation along the eastern creek boundary, he would be interested in her perspective, because the survey maps he'd inherited with the alderman purchase were, in his considered opinion, approximately 40 years out of date, and he would rather have an honest conversation with his neighbor than discover a conflict after it had already become a problem. She looked at him for a moment. Nobody had ever called her a neighbor before in a way that sounded like a compliment. She said she supposed she had some time on Friday afternoon. He said Friday afternoon would suit him very well. And that was how it started. Or rather, that was how they both pretended it started. Because if you asked either of them later, honestly, they would each privately admit that it had started the moment she rode up to that fence line and he put his hat in his hand without being asked. Friday became a habit. This was not discussed or decided. It simply accumulated, the way habits do, through repetition and the quiet understanding that both parties intended to continue. They met at the shared fence line on Friday afternoons through October and into November, and they talked about water rights and grazing boundaries and the coming winter and what the cattle market was doing and what the sheep market was doing and where the 2 of them agreed and where they disagreed, which was often and enthusiastically and without any animosity whatsoever. The county noticed. The county, of course, always noticed. Mrs. Hapwell at the dry goods store mentioned it to her daughter. The daughter mentioned it to her husband. Her husband mentioned it at the feed store. By the time the first significant snow of the season fell in mid-November, it was established county knowledge that Augustus Kane had been seen riding along Cecilia Drummond's fence line more times than strictly necessary for any professional purpose, and that Cecilia Drummond had been seen riding out to meet him with what one observer described as, and this was repeated verbatim across several social occasions, more promptness than she usually showed for church. Cecilia heard this comment secondhand through her foreman, a taciturn man named Ellis, who delivered it with the careful neutral expression of someone handling a substance of uncertain stability. She did not dignify it with a direct response. She told Ellis to check the north water tank and went inside and stood in her kitchen for a moment looking at the wall, and then she went back to work. Augustus Kane, for his part, had no foreman to relay county opinion to him. He had a housekeeper, a formidable Scottish woman named Mrs. Breckenridge, who simply told him directly one evening over supper that people were talking and asked him whether he intended to do anything about it. He said he wasn't sure yet. Mrs. Breckenridge said that was not a satisfying answer. He said he knew it wasn't. December came, and with it the brutal arithmetic of a Wyoming winter, which does not ask what you had planned and does not negotiate, and does not care in the slightest about the social arrangements you have been quietly building over the course of 2 months. The storm that hit in the second week of December was the kind that old-timers in Harlan County still reference 20 years later when they wanted to make a point about how hard things used to be. It came in fast from the northwest with 3 days of warning and then arrived half a day early, which is what storms do when they want to remind you that all your preparations were merely suggestions. Cecilia lost 7 sheep in the first night to exposure in a section of pasture where the temporary shelter had not held. She found them in the morning, stiff and silent under a foot of new snow, and she stood there looking at them in the gray light with her hands in her coat pockets and felt the familiar, blunt grief of a rancher who has learned that loss is part of the equation without ever quite making peace with it. She had her hands full for the next 4 days. They all did. And so she did not think about Augustus Kane's fence line or Friday afternoons or water rights or any of it. She thought about keeping the rest of her flock alive. And she did. On the 5th morning, when the storm had finally exhausted itself and the sky was the particular pale blue that follows real violence, she came out of the barn to find a man standing in her yard with a pack horse loaded with hay bales and 2 cords of split wood and a look of careful, professional neutrality that did not entirely conceal the fact that he had ridden 8 miles in the cold to get here. She stood and looked at him. She said she hadn't asked for help. He said he knew that. She said she didn't need charity. He said it wasn't charity, it was a neighborly exchange, and that he had lost a section of windbreak fencing in the storm, and he had heard from Ellis, who had apparently communicated the relevant information through channels Cecilia had not authorized, that she had experienced some structural issues on the east pasture shelter, and he happened to have spare lumber, and he was proposing a trade of materials, rather than any kind of gift. And if she was going to continue objecting, he would appreciate her doing it somewhere warmer, because he had been on a horse since 5 in the morning and he was cold. She looked at him for another moment. She said she supposed he'd better come in, then. He said he supposed he'd better. And that was the first time Augustus Kane sat at Cecilia Drummond's kitchen table, and it was not the last. By January, they were eating supper together once a week. This, too, was not discussed or decided. It evolved from the post-storm exchange of materials and the afternoon that followed, during which they had repaired her east pasture shelter together with the focused, complementary efficiency of 2 people who understood structural work and did not waste effort on conversation when their hands were already speaking clearly enough. When the work was done, she had fed him supper because it was practical, and because he had earned it, and because she was not an ungrateful woman. He had eaten it and thanked her and left before dark and come back the following Tuesday with a surveying map he had commissioned of the eastern creek boundary because he said it seemed like something they had both been meaning to sort out, and he had gone ahead and gotten the survey done if she had time to look at it. She had time to look at it. She fed him supper again. The week after that, he came on Tuesday with a question about sheep grazing patterns that he said was purely practical curiosity. She fed him supper, and he stayed until 9 o'clock, asking questions that were, she recognized, not purely practical in any recognizable sense, and were mostly an extended excuse to remain in her kitchen talking. She recognized this because she kept answering them when she could have simply ended the conversation an hour earlier, and she did not end it. The county knew about Tuesday suppers before the month was out. Mrs. Breckenridge told Augustus that people were now saying it was serious. He said he believed they were right. Mrs. Breckenridge said good and went back to her kitchen. If you are watching this right now, and you have ever known what it is to sit across a table from someone and realize, with a combination of terror and enormous relief, that you are not going to be able to talk yourself out of caring about them, I want you to leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from, because this story belongs to everyone who has ever sat in that chair. It was Ellis who told her, in March, that people were beginning to say she ought to think carefully about the situation, which was Ellis's way of telling her that people were saying things about her that were not entirely flattering, because a woman of 38 who entertained a man weekly in her home without any stated formal arrangement was, in the vocabulary of 1888, a woman inviting a specific kind of comment. Cecilia received this information without visible reaction, thanked Ellis for telling her, and spent the next 3 days being extremely composed and productive and not thinking about it at all, which was how she handled most things that required actual thought. On the 4th day, she went and found Augustus at his fence line, which was now entirely repaired and had been for months, and she told him what Ellis had told her, and she told him she was mentioning it, not because she cared what people said, but because she believed in having all relevant information available, and she thought he should have this particular piece of it. He listened without interrupting, which she still noticed and still appreciated. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he supposed there was a straightforward solution to the problem. She said she supposed there might be. He said he thought she probably knew what that solution was. She said she was aware of the conventional solution. Yes. He said he had been thinking about asking her something for about 4 months and had been putting it off because he was, if she wanted the truth, more frightened of her than of anything else he had encountered in a fairly eventful life. And he thought perhaps it was time to stop being a coward about it. She looked at him for a long moment. She said he didn't strike her as a man who was frightened of much. He said she was the exception. She said she would need to think about it. He said he had not actually asked yet. She said she was thinking about the question he was about to ask. He said that was a very efficient approach. She said she had always been efficient. He said he had noticed. She said give her a week. He said he would give her as long as she needed. She rode home and did not think about anything else for 6 days straight. The thinking, once she allowed herself to do it properly, was less complicated than she had been making it. This was frequently the case with the things she put off examining. She was afraid. Yes, she was afraid in the specific and reasonable way of a woman who had built something real and good, and entirely her own, and understood exactly what the legal and social structures of 1888 would do to the ownership of that something, if she entered into matrimony without the kind of ironclad arrangements that required very careful negotiation and a lawyer who would not simply defer to the husband on principle. She was afraid of losing herself. She had spent 16 years being entirely herself, and she was, privately, rather attached to the experience. She was also, and this was the part she had been least willing to examine, afraid of wanting something this much. Wanting and not getting was a particular kind of pain she had largely managed to avoid by the simple method of not wanting things she couldn't control. Augustus Kane was very much not something she could control. She had learned this definitively during the seed density argument in October, when she had revised her estimate, not because she had been beaten, but because his reasoning had been sound, and she had felt, in that moment, not diminished, but genuinely, unexpectedly delighted. That was the word. Delighted. She had not been delighted by a conversation since she was young enough not to know what a rare thing it was. On the 7th day, she rode to his property. Not to the fence line. To his house. She had never been to his house. She had made a point of it. She arrived at mid-morning, and Mrs. Breckenridge, who opened the door, did not appear even slightly surprised to see her, and showed her to the study without being asked, and went to find Augustus without any instruction whatsoever, which suggested to Cecilia that she had been expected for considerably longer than 7 days. Augustus came in and saw her standing in his study, and he stopped in the doorway for a moment, and then he came in and closed the door. She told him she had conditions. He said he expected nothing less. She told him she intended to retain full ownership of her property and her operation, and that she would require a formal written agreement to that effect before any other agreement was made, and that she would want her own lawyer to review it, not his. He said that was entirely reasonable, and that he had, in fact, already spoken to a property lawyer in Cheyenne about precisely this subject some weeks ago and had a draft prepared if she wanted to see it. She stared at him. He said he had been fairly confident about the direction this conversation was heading, even if he hadn't been confident about the timing. She said she also intended to continue managing her ranch entirely according to her own judgment, and that she was not interested in suggestions about how to run her sheep operation from a man who ran cattle, no matter what his other qualities might be. He said he would not dream of it, and that he had enough to do running his own operation without borrowing someone else's. She said she was not easy to live alongside. He said he had gathered that and found he didn't mind. She said she was asking him, now, directly, whether he was absolutely certain about this because she was not a woman who made decisions twice, and she would not revisit it. He said he had been certain since approximately the second morning of that pasture assessment when she had explained drainage patterns to him with the kind of precision that made him realize he had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone who thought about the world the way she did. She was quiet for a moment. She said that was either a very romantic thing to say or a deeply peculiar one. He said he had never been entirely sure there was a difference. She looked at him. She said, "All right then." They were married in April, in the Drummond Ranch House, by a judge who had known Cecilia for 15 years and Augustus for 4 months, and who told them afterward it was the most professionally conducted ceremony he had ever presided over. She kept her name. This was in the agreement. She was Cecilia Drummond on every document that mattered, and she remained so. He was Augustus Kane. They were neighbors who had decided to make the arrangement permanent, and if the county found this unconventional, the county said so to each other and not to either of them, because they had both individually developed reputations that made unsolicited commentary feel inadvisable. The Spinster label fell away. She had never worn it comfortably anyway. It had always been the county's word, not hers. She had simply been a woman waiting without knowing she was waiting, getting on with the considerable business of her life in the meantime, which is perhaps the most dignified way a person can wait for anything. The years that followed were not easy years. No years on the high Wyoming plains were easy years. There were droughts, and there were market collapses, and there was a brutal winter in 1893 that nearly broke both operations and did break several others. They faced all of it together with the combined practical intelligence of two people who had both survived hard things alone and discovered that surviving hard things together was a different category of experience entirely. They argued regularly and with great enthusiasm, and neither of them ever once won an argument by simply being louder than the other, which was the only kind of argument either of them found worth having. They built a joint water management system along the eastern creek boundary that became something of a regional model, because they had spent so much time talking about water rights in their first months that they had arrived at solutions nobody else had thought of yet. Ellis retired in 1901 and cried a little at his farewell supper and then denied it. Mrs. Breckenridge remained until 1906 and left only because her daughter in Glasgow was ill. And she kissed Cecilia on the cheek at the door and said she had never doubted it for a moment. And Cecilia squeezed her hand and said she had, plenty of times, which Mrs. Breckenridge accepted as the most honest thing a human being had ever said to her. Augustus died in the spring of 1911, quietly, of the heart, in the way that big and capable men sometimes go, as though the body has simply decided it has done enough and would like to rest now. He was 68 years old. He had lived long enough to see his cattle operation become one of the most respected in the territory, and to see Cecilia's sheep operation outlast 3 competitors, and to see the Eastern Creek Boundary Water System cited in a state agricultural report as an innovation worth studying. He died knowing all of this and knowing her, which he would have called the better of the two things if anyone had pressed him, though no one did, because people generally don't ask the right questions until it's too late to hear the answers. Cecilia buried him on the Drummond land, which was also the Kane land now in the informal, unlegislated way that two lives fully intertwined eventually become indistinguishable, even when the paperwork says otherwise. She was 62 years old. She had another 11 years ahead of her. She spent them running her operation with the same unflinching precision she had always brought to it, and she spent them missing him in the particular way that people miss those who had the courtesy to understand them completely, which is to say, not dramatically, not performatively, but daily and steadily like a low note held underneath everything else. She told her granddaughter once, in 1919, when the girl was 17 and interested in a young man who everyone said was very handsome and not much else, that the only question worth asking about a person you intended to spend your life with was not whether they were kind, though kindness mattered, and not whether they were capable, though capability mattered enormously, but whether they listened. Not whether they heard you, whether they listened. There was a difference, she said, and it was the whole difference, and if the girl found someone who listened the way she meant it, she should hold on to them with both hands and not let anyone's ideas about what was suitable or timely or conventional talk her out of it. The girl asked how she would know the difference. Cecilia looked at her for a moment. She said, "You'll know it the same way you know anything true about the world, which is that it will feel less like a discovery and more like a recognition, like something you already knew that you were finally being allowed to confirm." The girl thought about this for a very long time. She later said it was the best advice anyone ever gave her, which was high praise from a woman who lived to 91 and collected advice the way some people collect debts. There is a particular kind of woman the frontier produces. She is not made soft. She is made enduring. And the love that finds her, if it is the right love, does not ask her to be softer. It simply stands beside her in the cold morning air and argues about seed density and means every word of it. Whatever they told you about what love is supposed to look like, whatever age they said it was supposed to arrive, whatever shape they said it was supposed to take, Cecilia Drummond would like a word with them about all of it, and she would be very precise and largely correct, and she would not raise her voice even once.